Hey Nina, how are you?
Hi, Dan. I'm hanging in here and continue to hang in here for how long has it been? I'm losing track. Hey,
It's funny when we started this discussion, maybe now, 10 weeks ago, we were only a few weeks in, and today marks actually 3 full months that I've been working from home. So I guess this counts now as normal, and going back to work would be sort of abnormal now, right?
right, right. It is true, and we've adapted. I've noticed that your office looks brighter and more organized, and I've got a standing desk, which has made life so much more comfortable and doable with my back and long hours of working. So I think we've both made some improvements since we began this process.
I think so, but let's talk about today return to work. So we have Governor Lamont, who on May 20th indicated that offices can start to reopen on a limited capacity and with a lot of restrictions. And then on June 20th, we expect another round of reopenings, and hopefully in late July, yet another round as well. What are you hearing, and what are the concerns that you've been dealing with on your side?
Okay, so I have actually, that is consuming a great deal of my working hours, is addressing concerns that employees have about this phase two of the novel coronavirus, which is either those workers who are ready, willing, and able to come to work and are fearful about the employer's safety measures that they're taking, and what happens if they're inadequate and they need to complain about it, what will happen to them. Those who have loved ones at home who are vulnerable or are vulnerable themselves in terms of underlying health conditions and fear coming back to work and don't know how to handle that. And some who may very well have the virus and wonder how their lives will be impacted when they inform their employer that they're not able to. So I think there are a number of different concerns on that end, questions about how that's going to be handled. And we go back to talking about common sense communication with your employers being the first part. And then, Dan, for me, there's also a concern about maybe a disparate, an employer who is not making fair decisions about who to invite back and who not to invite back. And we can talk about that in a little bit, but I think that's a real concern as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that in a second. I think the what we're hearing on employers is there are a couple different groups. There are those who are sort of gung ho. Let's get people back to work. But I would think they're the minority. There are a lot of people who are spending a lot of time about how do we make the workplace safe for people to return to work. And Governor Lamont and the working groups, they're really set up a pretty strict group of guidelines that need to be followed um, uh, there. But I think even with those being followed, we're hearing the same concerns of employees who are just concerned, either for themselves or their families. And so increasingly over the last couple of weeks or so, I've been talking with employers about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and the paid leave provisions that are applicable there. And I think I'd spend a moment to mention that, which is, if an employee is either subject to a quarantine or stay-at-home order, or is caring for someone, or in a lot of cases now the child care provider is not yet open, uh,
Right.
that then the employees at employers 500 or less employees are eligible for paid leave. And so we've been really counseling employers, some of whom have never had to deal with paid leave provisions before or any FMLA, because anyone under 50 never had to deal with this, of how to implement that, what documentation is required, those types of things. So I think that's of the more pressing issues, the implementation of the paid leave provisions is at the top of my list.
Right. Yeah. And most definitely, these are still uncharted waters, and lots of employees are not aware of the rights under that act and the many others that have sort of morphed over time. And furthermore, I see some that would like to remain on unemployment because of their concerns about their own safety or the safety of their loved ones. And then there are questions revolving around that. If they're invited back, and some employers are actually making a concerted effort to say, come on back, to sort of set up that dynamic about who, if you're invited back and you decline, you may have challenges navigating unemployment in that context, and they need to be aware of what their rights are in that regard.
You know, I think that's probably a good segue to talk about Governor Lamont's executive order, which came out earlier this week, 7 UU. I really wish they would come up with better numbering
Right.
system than that. Are we going to get to 7 triple A in a few days? Um,
Probably.
but 7UU really now expands the unemployment eligibility for those who have concerns about the workplace safety, and it seems to be a very low bar now for employees to meet. And I think there's a concern among some employers, certainly not all, that that will be either abused or that people are not wanting to come back to work, not because of safety, but because of the extra $600
Sure.
benefit. There are, a group of employees who are actually making more on unemployment than they would in their job. Um, we could talk about the public policy perspective, whether that was good or bad, but I think if that doesn't expire, that gets extended, it's going to be, an impact for the long term of getting people back to work.
Right. No, there's, I certainly see it from both perspectives. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are plenty of employees who are actually eager to come back and may very well have been told that because of the economic impact on the business over the past couple of months, that they are being permanently laid off or continue to be furloughed. And again, as I alluded to before, I have seen some instances actually where I question the employer's motives as to who they've chosen to not invite back, and whether or not that person is a member of a protected class, who's older, someone who is just coming back from maternity leave. That's a recent case that I've had. Someone who is a person of color. And I know that the majority of employers, don't have those motivations, but there are some that do, and I've been seeing it happen already. I did write an article that was in the Connecticut Law Tribune and actually got published in smaller format in a letter to the editor of the New York Times, talking about this very issue, about unscrupulous employers who are using the coronavirus as a cover to either disguise retaliation or to disguise underlying discrimination. And again, I will say, Dan, not to raise any hackles, that I recognize that that is certainly is not reflective of all employers, but it is reflective of some.
No, clearly there is a small subset that have viewed this crisis as an opportunity to shrink their workforce and make decisions that, to some on the outside may appear to be either random or worse, discriminatory. Uh, on that. And I think employers do need to be cautious. They can't be making decisions that have a disparate impact on a protected group, and they shouldn't be making decisions based on things like age. The problem that we're seeing is you have the governor who has said those who are over 65 shouldn't be returning to work. He doesn't want to see it, and they should collect unemployment. And if you're an employer and you hear that, you go, all right, I don't need to bring anyone back who's over 65, and that's
Right?
not the case,
Not,
right? I think we
nope.
both agree
I
that
have a case right now. Yep. With those. Yeah.
the age law discrimination laws still apply. So I think there's confusion out there about the law more than anything else because you have, you know, the governor who is doing what he can to protect people, um, but by the same token, and he's saying those at high risk should also not return to work, and yet employers are going, well, then what am I supposed to do? And that's a real challenge right now. I see.
It really is because, it's funny. We talk about phase one, phase two, as if they're just compartmentalized, you know, pieces of time. And they're really not. There is this gray area that goes between phase one and phase two, and I would imagine is going to continue when we move on to phase three, where there's all of this murky uh, challenges that both employers and employees face, and that is makes it challenging even for you and I to figure out, what is the right thing to do in this particular circumstance. And so many people have unique circumstances that make it a case by case basis analysis.
Yeah, and then trying to get people back to work, it's a tough issue of how do you screen people? Because before this all went down, you couldn't take employees' temperatures, you couldn't send them to get tested on things, right? Those would be all things that we would say don't do. And
Right.
now it's sort of the opposite, which is no, if you want to do that, you can get tested for the virus. I think the antibody testing still right now is not as accurate as we would want, and I think even the CDC is cautioned about using it for employment decisions. But the now that the testing is a little bit more available, I think we're going to see employers mandate that a little bit more, particularly on return to work issues, because just taking an employee's temperature um, doesn't solve the issue.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's very clear, even as the layperson goes, that temp not any means dispositive, and asymptomatic people are, actually in some respects the most nefarious spreaders of the disease. And yeah, it's striking that balance between respecting employee privacy and the greater obligation you have to maintain the safety of your workforce. And I would be surprised actually if many right now would quibble with precautionary measures that employers are taking to ensure that everyone is safe when they come to work.
Yeah, and I think there's the balance between keeping employees safe, which I think is paramount, but also not being either paranoid or scared. I had one employer that was saying, well, can we mandate weekly tests on employees? And they're not a high risk employer. And you go, I suppose you can, but at what cost about things? So I, it's a challenging time because the guidance has continued to change. I mean, 3 months ago we were told, masks don't do anything, and now every piece of the guidance coming out says face coverings and masks are essential. So I think one of the takeaways that I've had from this is you have to be flexible, you have to adapt, and you can't just come up with a plan and go, all right, this is it, because that plan's going to change in a week or two or three based on new information.
That's exactly right. We have to remain nimble, and we as lawyers have to also stay on top what has just been a very sort of fluid and ever changing landscape.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So, what do you think that this goes next to sort of put a ribbon on this? What does the summer bring us in this area, and what should employees and employers be thinking about as we continue to go either back to work or continue?
Right. I think, and I alluded to this the last time. One of the most important precepts here is you and I are working completely out of our home office, and we're doing things we never before imagined we would do. I just had a mediation with multiple defendants and a magistrate judge, and we did it all via Zoom, and we had separate chat rooms, and we caucused and at certain key points. And there were a few IT glitches along the way, but it was surprisingly effective. If you had asked me 6 months ago, Nina, what do you think about the viability of Zoom mediations? I would have said they won't work. You need that in-person connection in order to make things happen. I'm wrong. So the same thing I would say for the workplace is that employers need to be open to the possibility that employees with certain guidelines and measures in place to ensure they continue to be productive may very well be able to work at home and continue to work at home effectively, which serves both the employee and the workforce. And then I guess on the other hand, employers have an interest in making sure that the employee continues to stay engaged and produce, and the employee has to be open to having his or her work, monitored in a way to ensure that level of contribution is maintained. I think that's one of the biggest watchwords going forward is be flexible in coming up with ways for employees to continue to work, continue to be engaged, continue to contribute, and still maintain safety. And that goes for those that have to return to work in terms of measures to continue that they remain safe in the physical workplace.
Yeah, I'd agree that flexibility is certainly something we've been preaching. I see the issue. I think the telework issue is where the next battle lines get drawn, because you have
Sure.
employees that have been working from home and pretty effectively at that in many instances. But you're going to get things like the independent schools and schools who need teachers. And the teachers, there's going to be a group of teachers, no doubt, who are going to say, I don't feel comfortable returning to work. And why can't I do a remote class? And that's going to be a battle about that, because
Sure.
in some cases the parents need the kids at school so that they can go back to their own work. um it's such a complicated dynamic, and there isn't a one size fits all solution here. And I think that goes back to what you were saying before, which is to be flexible. So well, why don't we wrap this up? Any closing thoughts you want to add about the time that we're living in now?
Well, yeah, and you and I discussed this, Dan, just the two of us. I think we would be remiss in closing this particular session without talking about what is going on in the world right now and in our own backyard. And that is this phenomenon. It used to be we were mindful of driving while black because people who were black who were driving were disproportionately being singled out for being pulled over for infractions, et cetera. I'd say at this point it's living while black, breathing while black, that there is a unfortunate environment in which black people are constrained to live, which can make every moment of the day, from the time they put their feet over the bed in the morning until bed at night, fraught with problems that you and I don't have. And or concerns or fears, real fears, legitimate, you and I have. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that. And while there are no easy answers in the workplace, I think employers would lose a valuable opportunity if they didn't acknowledge what was going on and offer to do what they could to be supportive, particularly during this time. And it's not going to end with Mr. Floyd, unfortunately. It's going to continue, and we need to just have this be at the radar screen.
I couldn't agree more. I certainly posted about it earlier this week, and I've been doing a lot more listening than talking. I think
Yes.
I think hearing the concerns of others and trying to come up with constructive solutions rather than saying that I know best is really critical during this time. So, and I think workplaces are going to be where the change comes from. And I've been heartened by seeing some of the comments from some of the nation's leading CEOs about the importance about this. And I think if they lead by example, and in many cases they have through their diversity of and inclusion programs, which are far more developed than than at smaller companies. I think we'll see some of that effect, but you know, it's a frustrating time right now because I think we all want change, and we know change doesn't happen overnight, unfortunately. And uh, but time to redouble our efforts in that regard. So um,
Absolutely.
I I love these conversations, Nina. I'm glad you're staying safe and healthy, and let's catch up again later this summer when we see how these reopening plans go.
I look forward to it, Dan. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.